Lesson 28. The special verbs. 7. Ought. Mr. Priestley, the next of our special verbs is ought. It's like the other specials in forming its interrogative by inversion and its negative with not, e.g. He knows he ought to pay the money. Ought he to pay the money? He ought not, oughtn't, to pay the money, ought he? You ought to be ashamed of yourself. 1. The general meaning, you see, implies duty, what is right. There is no other form of the verb except this one. There are no infinitives, no participles, no preterite, and the third person singular does not end in s. To give the idea of past time we use ought, oughtn't, to have in a past participle, e.g. I ought to have written that letter yesterday, with the implication but I didn't write it. You oughtn't to have gone to the football match, Hob, but you did. You ought to have done your homework last night, but you didn't. He ought to have told me that before, but he didn't. 2. There is another meaning of ought, i.e. probability, e.g. If Lucille left home at 9 o'clock, she ought to be here any minute now. There's a fine sunset, it ought to be a fine day tomorrow. Considering all the work you have done, you oughtn't to fail your examination. 3. The verb, ought, doesn't use, shall, or, will, for its future tense. If we want to express a future idea with ought we do it by means of a word or phrase denoting the future, e.g. Jan's team ought to win the match tomorrow. Your suit ought to be ready next Thursday. You ought to write to her as soon as you can. 4. Should, can generally be used instead of, ought, and with practically the same meaning. If you owe the money you, should, ought to, pay it. Lucille left home at 9 o'clock, she, should, ought to, be here any minute now. You, shouldn't, oughtn't to, have spent all that on a dress. Note, the infinitive after, ought, always has, to. With should, the to is omitted. Well, I don't think there's anything else I ought to tell you about, ought. Exercises. Exercise 1. Use, ought, instead of, should, in the following. 1. You should work harder. 2. It's 6 o'clock, she should be here by this time. 3. You should have done the work instead of going to the cinema. 4. He shouldn't have been late for that important meeting. 5. I suppose I should have been more careful. Exercise 2. Put the following into the past tense. 1. You ought to get here by 9 o'clock. 2. I suppose I ought to pay the money. 3. How much time should I spend on this exercise? 4. Mr. Priestley ought to tell you about this before you do the exercise. 5. You shouldn't leave my book out in the rain. 6. He ought not to speak like that. 7. Why should I do all the work? 8. Ought I to write out this exercise? 9. How much ought I to give him? 10. The wireless shouldn't make that noise. Dear friends, thank you for watching our channel and learning English with us. Subscribe. And we wish you great luck in achieving your goals.